Hey guys, how's it going? So this week is UFC Fight Night Taira versus Park, and I'm going to run through the whole card and give you guys my picks and predictions for each one of the fights. So let's get straight into it. And starting off the card on the prelims is Piera Rodriguez versus Ketlen Souza. So Piera Rodriguez most recently got a win over Josephine Knutson in a fight where she was consistently denying the takedown attempts from Knutson throughout the fight, and then on the feet for all 3 rounds she was just landing significantly more, dealing the real damage in that fight. Taking a decision win, granted against a pretty average opponent. She did lose somewhat recently to Jillian Robertson, where in the second round she got caught with this armbar, submitted, but even before that she wasn't really looking great. Jillian Robertson was dominating her in the grappling and wrestling, and then even outperforming her on the feet to an extent. But granted, Robertson is a very good opponent, so not the worst of losses. And she has had some wins over some very decent opponents throughout her career. Sam Hughes jumps to mind, who is always sort of fraud checking these up-and-comers within strawweight. And while there were moments on the feet where the fight got close, Rodriguez ultimately won the decision just through taking Hughes down every round, looking that little bit better on the ground, and just winning the decision through racking up the scorecards. Her opponent Ketlen Souza most recently lost to Angela Hill in a fight where Hill came out really strong in the first 2 rounds. She looked a lot better consistently on the feet. She was mixing up her shot selection, and then even in the first she was mixing in some takedowns and wrestling to secure that round. And while Souza did come back and took the third quite convincingly, it was just too little too late, and she ended up losing that split decision. The second was pretty close, but still I had it 2-1 Angela Hill. Before that, she took on Yasmin Jauregui at the Sphere, which the odds placed her as a pretty heavy underdog for that fight. Jauregui up until that point looked really good. All her performances were really dominant leading into that fight. And it was looking really bad on the feet early. Jauregui was constantly landing these big shots on Souza, doing some pretty big damage as well. But midway through the round, Souza catches Jauregui with this left hook, drops her badly, instantly jumps on the back of Jauregui, and once she's there, she locks in this rear naked choke, submits her within the first round. Very, very impressive win there. And while Souza is very well rounded, usually her biggest strength in her fights is her hands and her striking. She usually just out-volumes her way to a decision win, and it happened with Marnik Man. She was getting out-wrestled at points in the fight and almost submitted in the third, but consistently whenever the fight would get back to the feet, she'd look that bit better on the feet and took a decision win there. And while I think this fight will be pretty close, I just see Souza looking that little bit better on the feet, landing better shots, doing real damage, and I think she'll likely deal with any grappling threat that Rodriguez presents in this fight. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Ketlen Souza by a decision win for this one. Moving on from that, we have Rafael Estevam versus Felipe Bunes. So Estevam debuted in the UFC against a very difficult opponent in Charles Johnson, who has some big wins over some big names and is very solid. And while he did get beat up very badly in that third round, he didn't really let Johnson get the chance to stand and bang in this fight. In the first 2 rounds, very early in those rounds, he'd take him down, and then on the ground he'd just dominate him with his superior grappling and his wrestling and just hold him there, threaten some submissions here and there. And ultimately, it was him taking those first 2 rounds with the grappling that won him that unanimous decision. And then later, when he took on Jesus Aguilar, he employed the same strategy, constantly taking Aguilar down in those first 2 rounds, holding him there. But like last fight, he did sort of slip up in that third fight. He lets fights run away from him as they go on. But regardless, he still took the first 2 rounds, 29-28 decision win for him there. Very solid grappler. Felipe Bunes, only 2 fights within the UFC, probably had one of the worst matchups as well for his debut. He went up against Joshua Van, who, to his credit, he actually won that first round. He was landing more than Van, using his takedowns and wrestling to throw Van off his rhythm on the feet. But in the second round, Van employed his usual style, just getting Bunes up against that cage and constantly battering him with a barrage of punches. Got him, dropped him against the cage, and then finished him with some ground and pound. Kind of a rough debut though. After that fight, he came back against Jose Johnson, who he slowly managed to take down against the cage. It took a while for him to get him to the ground, but once it got to the ground, he pretty much instantly locked in this armbar, submitted Jose Johnson in the first round. But it should be noted that Jose Johnson is very easy to submit. He kind of struggles against grapplers because his long, lanky frame makes it a bit easier for him to get taken down and manipulated on the floor. And his record's full of submission losses, but a good win nonetheless. And while Bunes demonstrated some really good grappling in that Johnson fight, I think Estevam will be the better sort of grappler on the ground, and will most likely be the one holding dominant position if the fight gets to the ground. Bunes might have some success on the feet. I think that he is the better striker, but I can't really see much striking happening in this fight with someone like Estevam, who is very dominant on the ground. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Rafael Estevam by a decision win for this one. Next up is Austin Bashi versus John Yannis. So Austin Bashi, 12-0 leading into his Contender Series fight with a resume that was filled with quite a few finishes. And on the Contender Series, he looked just as dominant. He absolutely dominated his opponent in the wrestling in the first round, and then in the second round, managed to take the back with relative ease and submitted his opponent with a standing rear naked choke. He came into the UFC with a lot of hype, but in his debut up against Christian Rodriguez, who was a guy known for stopping these prospects at featherweight and bantamweight, he constantly beats these guys that are the next big thing and then loses to some guy who is average at best. But in this fight, he was just constantly reversing Bashi whenever he'd try and get him to the ground. Almost submitted Bashi early as well. But either way, on the ground, he'd constantly hold dominant position, reverse whenever Bashi would try and take him down, and ultimately took a 29-28 decision for that fight. His opponent, John Yannis, 9-3 in his professional career, and while a few of his wins are pretty good finishes, he usually goes to decisions, and most of the time they are pretty close, with him either just winning or just losing, a split decision. And I think a good point of comparison would be Yannis' fight with Cameron Smotherman, who recently joined the UFC, and while he isn't the worst fighter, he hasn't really proved to be the most dominant in his division, and Yannis lost a split decision to him, and I think moving to the UFC on short notice against someone like Bashi will be too much of a challenge when you consider sort of where Smotherman sits in the UFC currently, so I think he's going to struggle with this one, and I think Austin Bashi is going to win this one by a round 1 submission. Next up is Nick Klein versus Andre Puliev. So Nick Klein made his debut in the UFC against Mansa Abdul Malik recently, and for the first round of that fight, it was actually looking like he was going to comfortably win that fight. He was absolutely dominating Malik in the wrestling and holding him up against the cage for a large portion of the round and just controlling him in general. And he was also landing some big shots. He had Malik hurt at points up against the cage where he'd sort of batter him with these shots in the clinch. And Malik looked bad in that first round, but as the second round opened up, Malik managed to push Klein up against the cage, where he just starts unloading these massive shots, had Klein seriously hurt, and then for the last about 20 seconds before the finish, he just unloads the gas tank, starts nailing Klein with everything he has left, and managed to get a TKO finish for that one. Pretty hard opponent to debut against though, so not the worst loss for Klein. His opponent Andre Puliev had an impressive performance on the Contender Series, with his debut after that being against Christian Leroy Duncan, and in this Duncan fight he looked absolutely horrendous. He didn't throw anything, let alone anything of significance that fight, and the whole fight he was either clinching against a cage or running away on the back foot. Didn't even really let Duncan get much off on him because he was constantly circling on the back foot. And while he could improve since that loss, I think he is going to come back a little bit better this fight. I can't rely on that. I mean, it was probably one of the worst fights of the year. Puliev didn't throw anything. He didn't even look like he did on the Contender Series, so maybe this will be decently close, but I actually rate Nick Klein. I think Klein had a pretty rough go in his debut, and I think that Puliev won't be able to overcome that constant pressure from Klein in this fight. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Nick Klein, and I'm going to say by a decision win for this one. Up next is Rodolfo Vieira versus Tresean Gore. So Rodolfo Vieira most recently had a pretty uneventful fight against Andre Petroski, where not really much happened this whole fight. They're both very good on the ground. Petroski is a very good wrestler. Vieira is good with his BJJ, but for some reason this fight stayed standing for pretty much the whole duration, with Petroski mainly winning on the feet, just looking a bit busier, landing the better shots in between the rounds, and ultimately took a decision, but it wasn't a really high volume fight from either side. Before that, he had a much better performance against Armen Petrosian, where he was allowed to use his grappling in this fight, and he used it to his advantage. He took Petrosian down multiple times in the first round, and then late in the first round, caught him in an arm triangle on the ground, submitted him within the closing seconds. A much better performance, and this is where Vieira succeeds most in his fights, when he goes up against less experienced grapplers and is able to comfortably take the fight to the ground, where he sort of imposes his will over his opponent. It happened with Cody Brundage in their fight, where he got beat up quite badly in the first. He even got dropped and almost finished. Wasn't really able to get much wrestling off in that first round, but in the second, when the fight got to the ground, Vieira ended up reversing position and managed to submit Brundage with another arm triangle midway through the second round. So he's definitely the better fighter when it comes to the grappling. His opponent Tresean Gore most recently got beat up pretty badly when taking on Marco Tulio at UFC 314, where from early in the first round, Tulio was just landing big on the head of Gore, even knocking him down, almost finishing him in that first round, before in the second round dropping and finishing him with a big straight right directly to the head that put him down. Follow-up punches finished him. Very good performance from Tulio. Gore looked pretty average in that one. Before that, Gore had some pretty good wins though, with his fight before that being against Antonio Tricoli, where early in the first round, when the fight gets up against the cage, Gore manages to catch Tricoli's head in a guillotine, and from there he just cranks it hard, very quickly forcing Tricoli to tap and submitting him early in the first. And while his fight against Josh Friend played out pretty much the exact same way, He was kind of struggling a bit more on the feet throughout that fight, but in the second round, he got an identical guillotine, and he managed to lift Fremd off his feet and sort of flip him over onto the ground, where he locked it in even tighter and submitted him with that same sort of guillotine. He's very, very strong with his guillotines and submissions, but I don't think Gore will sort of prevail when it comes to the grappling in this fight, with Vieira being a very, very good wrestler. However, I do think on the feet, Gore will just be that little bit better. Vieira might dominate on the ground. I think Gore also has a bit more submission ability in this fight, but I think ultimately it'll just be Gore's well-roundedness that carries him through to this one. So I'm going to go with Tresean Gore by a round 3 submission for this one. And closing out the prelims is Rinya Nakamura versus Nathan Fletcher. So Rinya Nakamura, early in his career, he was looking like an incredibly dangerous grappling prospect, with his fight against Fernie Garcia being 3 rounds of Nakamura just absolutely dominating Garcia on the ground, even almost submitting him at one point during every round, and he couldn't quite finish him in this fight, but in the end, he ended up taking a 30-27, very dominant decision win here. And following that, he had another really good win over Carlos Vera, 298, where played out pretty much the same. Nakamura would get Vera to the ground, and from there, he just absolutely dominated him, assert his physicality in the wrestling, hold dominant positioning for most of the fight, threaten a submission here and there. But ultimately went to the decision, 30-27 again, another really dominant win. And it seems recently he sort of hit a wall. He went up against Miun Gafarov recently at UFC 311, and the fight was just a complete 180 to what we're used to seeing. It stayed standing for its whole duration, which was the first big issue. Nakamura wasn't really pushing the wrestling or the grappling as much as he usually does, and as a result, Gafarov was just beating up on him throughout the whole fight, knocking him down particularly badly in the second round. And even when the fight would get to the ground, there were parts where Gafarov was dominating in the grappling, and ultimately Gafarov ended up taking a 30-27 against Nakamura in this one, so really bad recent performance. His opponent here, Nathan Fletcher, debuted in the UFC off a tough season, and his first fight was against Ramaska, where in the first round it was very competitive. Fletcher was getting the takedowns, but Ramaska was keeping reversing position and keeping control time. But in the second round, Fletcher gets Ramaska to the ground again, and this time manages to catch Ramaska in a triangle choke that submitted him midway through the second round. Following that, he went up against Karol and Logren in a fight that ended up going to a really, really close split decision, which I actually thought Fletcher won. I thought he dealt significantly more damage and was only really losing the fight through being taken down quite often and being held up against a cage mainly. With Logren not really doing much damage and only really succeeding in being physically better in the grappling. But either way, Fletcher lost that very close split decision. And while I think Fletcher is good and his recent loss doesn't really reflect what he's capable of, I think this fight will become a grappling match at some point, and I think Nakamura is just that little bit better than Fletcher when it comes to the grappling. If it stays standing, I can see Fletcher winning this quite comfortably. But Nakamura's wrestling is not something to be sort of messed with, and I think in this fight he will go back to trying to push the grappling a bit more. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Rinya Nakamura, and I'm going to say by a decision win for this one. And opening the main card is Danny Silva versus Kevin Vallejos. So Danny Silva debuted in the UFC against Josh Kulabau, where the fight went to a really close split decision. Kulabau looked significantly better on the feet, but Silva was keeping it competitive, using his takedowns and wrestling to keep the fight roughly even when it came to round-to-round scoring. With the fight coming down to a really close second swing round that Silva just managed to take, but it was really, really close. Following that, he had another pretty close fight with Lucas Almeida that also ended in a split decision, and I thought was a little bit clearer for Silva compared to the Kulabau fight, with Silva winning in the striking for pretty much the whole fight outside the third, while sort of Silva took that decision. It was still a very, very close fight in the end, and Almeida did keep it competitive, but yeah, two sort of close wins back-to-back for Silva here. Kevin Vallejos only recently debuted in the UFC, where he got paired up against Swingwoo Choi, and in this fight, it was just illuminating to what Vallejos is capable of. He looked completely dominant on the feet for most of the fight. He was backing Choi up for pretty much the whole fight, and then midway through the first round, he dropped Choi badly when it went up against the fence, put him away with some ground and pound following, getting dropped with a big right hand. In a finish that a lot of people were comparing to Ilia Topuria, with how fast he can blitz in, his hands, the power he possesses in them, how good he is at sort of closing the distance and putting people out. And while I think Danny Silva is a pretty solid fighter, winning both of his fights in the UFC, granted by very close split decisions, Vallejos is a very, very scary debut, and even earlier in his career, he's taken some of the best to very close decisions. He actually took Gene Silva to a decision early on in his first Contender Series bout, which is nothing to laugh at. I mean, that's very, very impressive. No one's even come close to doing that outside like maybe Drew Dober. And I just think Kevin Vallejos is going to be the next big guy. So I'm going to go with Kevin Vallejos, and I'm going to say by around 1 KO for this one. Next up, we have Magny versus Elizeu, Zaleski dos Santos. So Magny, known as a gatekeeper within the welterweight division, with him sort of being the final test fighters get before they make their way towards the rankings. And some can't cut it. Mike Mallet couldn't really do it. In their fight, it was really dominant from Mallet leading up to the third round. And even for most of the third round, it was very dominant, with him looking way better in the striking as well as the wrestling. But in the final minutes of the fight, Magny gets top mount and just starts ground and pounding Mallet, and then eventually Mallet sort of covers up before letting the hands go a little bit, folding up, curling up, not really trying to transition or anything, and ultimately the ref comes in, stops it with a ground and pound TKO late in that third round, and Magny managed to pull off this comeback KO to prove that Mallet wasn't really ready for that top 15. But more times than not, people kind of go through him. Michael Morales was sort of the first big win in his career that really put his name on the map, where he absolutely beat up on Magny for the whole fight. And then in the sort of second half of that first round, lands this brutal spinning elbow on Magny, dropped him badly, had him out on the floor, barely conscious. And then he followed up with some ground and pound, finished the fight via TKO late in the first round. And a really good win from Morales there. And again, after that, he got put up against Carlos Prates, who at the time was one of the scariest welterweight prospects, with him having 4 very scary back-to-back knockouts, all performance bonus winning. And while in the first round, nothing particularly dominant was shown from either side, in the closing seconds of the round, Prates gets Magny up against a cage where he throws a right hand that doesn't even look like it lands, but it must have just skimmed the temple or landed perfectly on that temple of Magny, because he folded forward, he was out cold. On the ground. Prates got another very scary knockout to add to his resume at the time. And that's mainly Magny's main goal, to hype up the next guy into that top 15 spot. Zaleski dos Santos most recently went up against Chidi Njokuani, where he really struggled with the range of Njokuani. He was constantly being picked away at distance. He lost that first round pretty clearly due to that. And then in the second, he got hit with a big knee down the middle that connected huge on him, put him down almost out, to which Njokuani dove in, finished the fight, round 2 TKO, ground and pound. Before that, though, dos Santos had some pretty good performances. One against Zach Scroggin, where early in the fight, dos Santos backed Scroggin up against a cage, has him hurt really badly with a right hand over the top that dropped him. And then finished him shortly after with some ground and pound, taking a first round TKO. Very impressive win there. And while before that he did lose to Randy Brown at UFC 302, getting outstruck and hurt quite badly on the feet throughout the fight, even being out wrestled at points. The second round was definitely a dos Santos round though, and the wrestling sort of carried him through certain parts of that fight. Ultimately he lost at 29-28, but I think even making it to a decision with someone like Randy Brown isn't an easy thing to do, and it's not the worst loss. And I do think this will be one of the closest fights on the card. I actually see this one going to a really close decision, if not a split decision, with both being pretty equal in skill. But I do think dos Santos will be slightly better in the grappling. And even in the striking, I think he is a little bit more powerful than Magny, while Magny will sort of rely on volume. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos for this one. I'm going to say by a decision win. And moving on from that, we have Karol Rosa versus Nora Cornolle. So Karol Rosa most recently took on Aylin Perez at UFC 311, where she did look better in the striking for a large part of the fight, landing the better shots, but really couldn't overcome the constant grappling threat and takedown attempts from Perez, and ultimately lost that one due to that to a 29-28 decision, just by constantly being taken down and controlled on the ground. Before that, Rosa picked up a pretty good win over Pani Kanzad, where once again she looked better in the striking, doing some brutal damage and cutting open the face of Kanzad, with elbows particularly, but also the shots were sort of busting open the face, and just constantly looking one step ahead when it came to the striking. That one was a lot more of a dominant performance from her, taking a 30-27 decision. However, before that, she had an absolute war with Irene Aldana, where both threw a ridiculous amount of punches. The fight stayed on the feet for pretty much the whole time, and while Rosa did look good in that first round, following that, Aldana just began to pick it up in the striking, doing some massive damage and swelling the face of Rosa really, really badly. The photos from after the fight are insane, but you know, these rounds where Aldana would pick up were complete domination. Rosa was constantly thrown back though, landing her own big shots and cutting open and hurting Aldana. But in the end, Aldana just did a bit more in those second 2 rounds. Took a 29-28 decision, but that was a really fun fight with a lot of volume. Nora Cornolle recently fought at UFC 314 against Hayley Cowan, where Cornolle lost that first round clearly, really struggled with the grappling of Cowan, not really being able to get back to the feet when it would get taken to the ground. But early in the second round, when the fight gets to the ground again, Cornolle successfully takes the back of Cowan, and then shortly after locks to this rear naked choke. to submit Cowan. Before that, Cornolle had a significantly less impressive performance against Jacqueline Cavalcanti, where Cornolle looked good early on, even pushing for the takedowns and grappling, which she doesn't usually do. But as the fight went on, Cavalcanti slowly got sort of busier. Cornolle got a bit outworked on the striking there, and she ended up losing a very close split decision, but I could see Cavalcanti taking those last 2 rounds. And while she is sometimes good in the grappling, I think Cornolle's best weapon is usually her striking. Her fight against Melissa Mullins showed this very competitive fight in the first round, Cornolle choosing to sort of wrestle with Mullins, losing dominant position in parts of the round. But in the second on the feet, she hurts Mullins badly with a knee in the clinch before landing 2 sort of back-to-back head kicks that dropped Mullins badly, and had the fight finished with some follow-up ground and pound. One of her more impressive wins there, especially against someone like Mullins, who I think is pretty good. And while I think this will be a very competitive striking battle with neither fighter really having a strong ground game, I think Cornolle is just the more impactful fighter when it comes to her striking and her power in her hands. And while Rosa does usually put up a good fight and always fires back, I just can't see her doing the bigger damage by the time the bell goes off, and I do see this one going to a decision. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Nora Cornolle, and I'm going to say by a decision win for this one. Up next is Elves Brener versus Esteban Ribovics. So Elves Brener coming off a really bad loss to Yoel Alvarez, who admittedly is one of the better lightweight prospects at the moment. He's kind of on a tear at the moment. But this fight was just a complete beatdown from start to finish. Brener did have moments here and there, but ultimately it was Alvarez who was just constantly beating on him, doing a lot of damage. You could tell that Brener was hurt in the later rounds. And then in the end, he ended up getting dropped with a knee to the body and knees to the head. Wilted, dropped to the floor, and then Alvarez finished up with some ground and pound to take a TKO win in that one. Bad performance from Brener there, and even before that, he also had another really bad performance against Miktabek Oralbai at UFC 301, where he lost every round. He just mainly got beat on the feet. Oralbai was landing good in the striking, even knocking him down badly in the third. But in the case of the first and the second, Oralbai was also out-wrestling him, out-physicaled him on the ground, held dominant positioning. Usually Brener is good at the jiu-jitsu. He trains at Shoot Box with Charles Oliveira, but he couldn't really engage with any of that because Oralbai was just so physically demanding on the ground. Ultimately, Oralbai took a 29-27 decision. It would have been a 30-27 had he not got a point deduction in the third for, I think it was grabbing the cage. But either way, really bad performance from Brener. Despite his recent losses, though, Brener does have some good wins, with his last win being a first-round finish, where Brener sort of didn't really throw much, and then out of nowhere landed this double overhand combo that absolutely slept his opponent badly, had him out cold. Brener won a performance bonus for that, so he is good here and there, but recently not so much. Esteban Ribovics, his opponent, has recently had one of the better fights within the UFC, with him recently going to a really fun fight against Terrence McKinney, who is really, really dangerous early on in a fight, especially that first round. He's sort of trying to take your head off or submit you out the gate. But in this fight, Ribovics sort of managed to back him up, weathered the storm of McKinney in the first 30 seconds, and then very quickly put him out with a big kick straight to the head against the cage. Put McKinney out cold, had him sort of slouched against the cage, sitting down while being sort of knocked out. One of the more brutal knockouts I've seen. And of course, you can't ignore the fight he had with Daniel Zellhuber at the Sphere. One of the best fights of the year, if not the best fights within the UFC, full stop. Where they both came out the gate trying to hurt each other badly, kind of trying to finish each other from the start to end. There were moments where Ribovics would be ahead, then Zellhuber would catch up. In the third, Ribovics had Zellhuber on his last legs, ducking and weaving against the cage on the brink of being out, before Zellhuber came back and knocked him down with a massive punch. Ultimately went to a split decision. Very, very, very close fight that Ribovics just managed to take, but ridiculously close fight. And recently he did lose to Nasrat Hakparas, but that was a fight where, once again, both fighters were just constantly landing on each other. They were pretty even when it came to strike stats, and Ribovics looked a lot better on the feet in the second. But in the third, Hakparas started putting some wrestling in, taking Ribovics down, and won that round. And it came down to a first round that honestly could have gone either way. They gave it to Hakparas. I'm not mad. It's not really a robbery, but very, very close fight. And while Brener's recent fights haven't really been that great, I don't think it's indicative of his overall skill. He does have his moments here and there, but Ribovics is just a guy who is probably the next big guy at lightweight if he keeps going the way he's been going recently. Granted, close split decisions, but they're always fights where he was firing back, not giving his opponents the opportunity to recover, and you do need to be something special to get past Ribovics. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Esteban Ribovics, and I'm going to go by a decision win for this one. And now the co-main event, Mateusz Rebecki versus Chris Duncan. So Rebecki's coming off a really fun back and forth war against Mikdebek Orolbai at UFC 308, where Orolbai technically outlanded Rebecki. He definitely landed more volume as the fight went on, and in the grappling and wrestling, he definitely dominated this fight. He out-physicaled Rebecki on the ground, controlled him for most of the time it was on the ground. But what won Rebecki this very close split decision fight was his striking. He was landing way bigger on Orolbai. Particularly in the third, he knocked him down and almost had him finished, but Orolbai managed just barely to survive that. Took it to a close split decision where the damage was showing on Orolbai a lot more than Rebecki. Orolbai's whole right side of his face was swollen massively, and Rebecki took that one just through the damage from his punches. Before that, he took on Diego Ferreira, where early on, Rebecki looks like he was going to win this fight quite convincingly. He knocked down Ferreira very early in the first round, and from there, had him hurt multiple points in that round. But as the fight went on, Ferreira slowly just started to pick it up in the striking, doing big damage to the face of Rebecki. You could see the damage start to accumulate as the fight went on. And then in the closing seconds of that fight, he managed to get the fight to the ground, to which he found a ground and pound TKO finish in top mount. Granted, it was sort of a bit of an early stoppage. There was only 10 seconds left in the round, and the ref only really stopped it because Rebecki stopped trying to transition from sort of bottom. He could have seen it right out. He would have lost regardless by a decision, but it was kind of an early stoppage. And while Rebecki does heavily rely on his striking, his grappling is also pretty solid. In his fight against Roosevelt Roberts, it ended midway through the first round, when in a grappling exchange, Rebecki locked in an armbar and submitted Roberts quickly, showing that he has a bit more levels to his game, and that his grappling is something that he doesn't often pull out, but is something that is very solid. Chris Duncan most recently had a very big upset win over Jordan Vucenic, where in the first round he knocked Vucenic down early in that round, and then from there he just controlled him for the rest of the round on the ground, being a lot more physical when it came to the wrestling. And while Vucenic did start to come back in the second round in his striking, sort of being the better striker early on, Duncan manages to repeatedly get the fight to the ground, and in the second round he managed to catch Vucenic in this really tight guillotine, submits him midway through the second, and Duncan is really strong when it comes to his submissions, particularly his guillotine. He got a similar one against Balaji Oki, which was a fight where he was constantly getting taken down by Balaji Oki, surprisingly. And when Oki tried to shoot in for, I think, a third or fourth time, Duncan latches in this guillotine, gets it to the ground, lets the fight go to the ground where he takes bomb position, and then squeezes that guillotine and submits Oki midway through the first round. Another very impressive submission here. And while he is very good with his guillotines, and he does have good submission ability, he isn't the strongest wrestler, strangely enough. He actually got out-wrestled by Manuel Torres when they fought, which is weird because Manuel Torres is usually a striker and is sort of known for his knockout power in his hands. But early in this fight, Torres takes the back of Duncan and manages to lock in this rear naked choke that submits him midway through the first round. So, while I think Duncan does present a grappling threat, and definitely wrestling-wise, I think he will be slightly better than Rebecki, I don't see Rebecki letting the fight get to the ground that often, and I think when it does, he can handle his own. But on the feet, I think the striking is going to be day and night, and Rebecki will be doing a significantly more damage to Duncan. Potentially maybe finding a finish, but I don't think that's the case. Duncan's got a decently good chin on him. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Mateusz Rebecki by decision win for this one. And now on to the main event, which was originally supposed to be Amir Albazi versus Tatsuro Taira, and it's now Tatsuro Taira versus Hyun Sung Park. So Taira, at a time, was one of the most dangerous up-and-coming prospects in the flyweight division. He had a career full of very impressive dominant wins, mainly his grappling. And a win over Carlos Hernandez sort of put his name on the map. In the first round, it was complete domination from Taira in the grappling. He absolutely controlled Hernandez for the whole first round. And then in the second round, he manages to catch Hernandez on the chin, hurts him badly, drops him badly, and then dives in, goes for ground and pound, and finishes the fight via TKO in the second round. And while he did get a TKO win there, Taira's grappling is his strongest weapon, with his fight against Alex Perez being a sort of competitive fight on the feet. In fact, Perez was winning that first round and parts of the second in the striking, but what was keeping it close was Taira constantly shooting in, taking Perez down, and then holding him on bottom position or sort of transitioning and taking whatever dominant position suited him. And midway through the second round, Taira takes the back of Perez. Perez tries to stand up, and in the standing sort of thing with Taira on his back, he manages to throw Perez enough off balance that he actually sustains a knee injury when going back down to the ground. Finished the fight in the second round due to an injury, but either way, Taira did sort of dominate in the wrestling enough that I could have seen him winning it if it went to a decision. But recently, his undefeated status got taken away by Brener and Royval, who admittedly isn't the worst loss to have. He's been a top contender within the division for a very long time now, if not most of his career. And in this fight, it went to a very close split decision that Royval just managed to pull through. He looked significantly better on the feet, was facing some adversity with Taira's grappling and takedowns in certain rounds, but ultimately it was Royval's constant picking away at the feet, doing a lot more damage, and just looking the better striker out of the two that gave him enough of the rounds to win that fight. Close split decision though. Hyun Park coming off a road to the UFC season where he debuted in a pretty decent performance. He looked better on the feet for most of the fight, did get caught and dropped in the second, but near the end of the third round found this rear naked choke and managed to finish the fight via that. Following that fight, he had a much more dominant performance over Shannon Ross, where in the striking, he looked like a much stronger fighter. He dealt a lot more damage to the body and head of Ross in the first round, and even dropped him in that first round. And then in the second, dropped him again with his big body shot, and then following that, dove in, finished the fight via ground and pound. And even somewhat recently, he got another finish over Carlos Hernandez, where Hernandez wasn't able to get anything off on the feet before Park took him down very early in the round and absolutely controlled him for the fight. And he eventually took the back and submitted Hernandez in that first round with a rear naked choke. Another really impressive finish for him in the UFC, 3 back-to-back finishes. And while I think Park has looked absolutely dominant in most of his fights thus far, the competition he's been going up against does not even come close to having the resume of Taira or being as competitive as Taira. And with this fight being a late minute step up, he was originally supposed to fight Steve Erceg, which is a very different style to someone like Tatsuro Taira. I think he is going to struggle with Taira, who will presumably be much better in the grappling, and I also think will be a lot more dominant when it comes to the striking. And I just think this is too much for him too early in his career, especially on late notice. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Tatsuro Taira, and I'm going to say by a round 4 submission win for this one. So that's it, guys. That's UFC Fight Night, Taira versus Park, and all of my picks and predictions for this card. Right now on the screen is a compilation of all of my picks and predictions, all of Cam's picks and predictions. You already know how this goes. This card's been a bit crazy, I'm going to be honest with you. There were a lot of fighters that I was actually really excited to see. I mean, Andre Lima, Azamat Bakoev, even the Albazi I would have been happy to see, but they've had to swap out everyone, a lot of injuries, a lot of withdrawals. Park, I don't know why he got the shot over Erceg. If anything, I'd picture move Erceg forward, keep Park on that card versus O'Day Osborne, but I don't know, maybe they see something in Park that I don't. Yeah, this card's been a bit messy, to put it lightly, but hopefully it's a good card. I'll see you guys at the end of the week with my breakdown. Yeah, bye bye.